our budget public hearing. And this has been a really challenging time for our school districts and many school districts across our state. This is something that is typically, board hearing time is in the month of April, and we are now here in July looking at an amended 24-25 school year budget. And tonight is our official public hearing on that amended budget. I have a couple of comments in regard to the budget as we set the stage for the public hearing by Mr. Boyce. The amendment reflects legislation passed just 2 months ago, legislation that provides a narrow window of opportunity to districts like Freehold Regional who have been devastated by state aid funding cuts since the passage of the S2 bill in 2018. As many of you know, S2 sought to shift state funding between school districts over a 7-year period based on certain wealth indicators. Freehold Regional was on the wrong side of S2. This has really been echoed in our district for the past 7 years. This district has aggressively and relentlessly challenged S2. And despite victories to either minimize or defer state losses, the compounding impact of S2 has significantly damaged our financial footing. And I don't say this lightly, has put this district on a trajectory that poses a very real threat to the depth and breadth of the student opportunities that this community has come to expect. I want to give you a sense of the magnitude of state funding lost under S2. The 24-25 budget includes $30.6 million in state aid. That's 40%, $21 million less than the pre-S2 funding levels. The cumulative loss in state aid over the S2 years, it's a staggering $97.7 million. In addition, the district is slated to lose $10.8 million in the 25-26 year school budget per the most recent state aid calculations. So if that state aid formula was enacted, we are set to lose $10.8 million in the 25-26 year budget. Senate 3081 is in response to a well-known fatal flaw in the implementation of S2. In short, state aid cuts under S2 were intended to offset increases in property taxes. However, due to a law capping property tax levy increases at 2%, a law not considered in the design of the funding formula, or S2, districts were not able to access tax revenues as S2 intended. This legislation acknowledges that the 2% property tax levy cap has undermined the funding formula and allows districts to recover a portion of the taxes that should have been levied in prior years according to the formula. The budget that we're going to be presenting tonight reflects an additional $10,175,000 in property taxes, bringing the total tax levy increase, which is inclusive of the original 2%, to 8.7%. While this is by no means a comprehensive solution to our financial position, it is potentially a meaningful step in the right direction. To put context, this district under S2 had to abolish 115 positions over the S2 years. If this budget passes tonight, this administration is prepared to hire 12 teachers, 1 nurse, and 6 secretaries, staff that were cut in this budget. This is important for us to immediately prepare for the opening of school and also reinstate programs that were cut. These efforts will continue with additional hires, hopefully at future board meetings. But it is important that we take this step tonight in restoring some of the positions that we have lost over these S2 years. Our priorities are our instructional program, the supports that we have for students, and the tremendous human capital that we have in the educators of this school district for our students. That's one piece, as well as also the maintenance of our facilities for our students in this district. So at this time, Mr. Boyce, our business administrator and assistant superintendent, is going to walk us through the amended school year 24-25 school year budget.
Thank you,
Mr. Boyce.
Thank you. And there are some really key elements that Dr. Hazel just touched on in her opening remarks. As far as the context of school funding goes, this piece of legislation and the very limited window that districts that are similarly positioned to Freehold Regional have to make a decision on what direction they would want to go. So just to expand on some of Dr. Hazel's comments, this is how the funding formula works in a very straightforward way, and it's not a complex formula conceptually. The state has an obligation under the state constitution to provide a thorough and efficient education to all students. So in order to do that, back in 2008, they developed the funding formula called the SFRA, the School Funding Act, School Funding Reform Act. And this replaced a funding formula that was its predecessor, which about 10 years previous replaced a funding formula. So every decade, every 10 to 20 years, the state goes back and looks at funding formulas for schools. But here's how they go about it. They first quantify how much should it cost a district to provide a thorough and efficient education. That's step one. And then step two is, how are we going to pay for it? So step one, they've developed a cost model, right? And they take each district's enrollment and push that through the cost model to come up with what they call an adequacy budget, as in an adequate amount of money to provide a thorough and efficient education. That adequacy budget is then, and that number is different for each school district because enrollment is different for each school district. Phase two of it, how are we going to pay for it? The way it works is the local community first, to the extent that they're able, and then state aid to make up the difference, so that every district ends up at their adequacy budget, receiving funding for their adequacy budget. Now there are some tricky parts to this, and the one that this district and a handful of other districts have taken issue with and pushed on, and even are in the middle of legal proceedings to get to the bottom of the methodology to measure a community's ability to pay, or their local fair share. Because remember, community first, state aid fills in the difference. So the way that works is there are wealth indicators. One is the fair market value of the properties in the town, and the other is income per the most recent state income tax returns. And those two numbers are translated into ability to pay. Now those variables that translate the wealth indicators into ability to pay has what really has been the core of the issue for Freehold Regional, because it's very volatile. It's up, down, it's all over the place. And it is also directly influences the amount of state aid that the state would have to contribute to Freehold Regional, and each district for that matter, but Freehold Regional for us. So as the local fair share goes up, the amount the state contribution goes down. But the key metric, so it's a fairly straightforward approach. There's some nuance to the details of that, but I agree with the bones of it and how they're going about it. I just think we need to be consistent, predictable, and fairly distribute state aid across all districts in the state. So really the key metric there is adequacy budget. So that's the number that all districts would need to get to. And I want to look at that for Freehold Regional in recent years. So this is where we stand on where we are in relation to our adequacy budget. As you can see, over these last 2 years, we have fallen further and further and further below adequacy. And one of the reasons for that is that the SFRA, or funding formula, if you will, was not designed with an entirely independent law capping increases on the property tax levy to 2%. So where the state was taking funds away from Freehold Regional, the design intent of the funding formula was that the district would be backfilling that with property taxes so that the two of them together reach the mark, the adequacy budget mark that the formula intends to districts to meet. So this has been the trajectory. We are now some $19 million below adequacy, and the strategic sacrifices that the district has made along the way over these 7S2 years have damaged the structural integrity of our financial position, and they're running their course as we knew would run their course the whole way. We did this alongside fierce advocacy against S2 and trying to get to the bottom of the calculation for the local fair share, because we think that's really the core of the problem. So we've not had much luck, although we were able to get some legislation passed that deferred the final 2 years of S2, which was the year we just finished and the year we're just beginning, deferred the state aid cuts that were due under the funding formula. Those 2 years amount to $10.8 million, and that's what we are scheduled to be cut for the next budget we put together, the 25-26 budget. So if nothing else changes, we'll drop even further below, similar to the trajectory that you see here. So this legislation comes out, and as Dr. Hazel said, it was in May, and districts that are in this position have until tomorrow to make a decision of whether or not they want to exceed the 2% cap on the property tax levy. And as Dr. Hazel mentioned, this legislation really acknowledges that those two things, right, the funding formula and the 2%, they're unrelated, and the 2% cap on the levy really undermines the design intent of the funding formula. So there was a measure, a look back of several years, and a measure of districts that can levy tax that should have been levied along the way, and that's what's being considered here tonight. But I also want to show another chart that with below adequacy funding, as expected, we have below typical spending. All right, so Freehold Regional is highlighted there at the cost per pupil. There is audited numbers. Every school district is audited. That feeds into the state. They analyze it and group districts in a comparable way. So for us, it's the 9 to 12 high school only districts, which there are only 31 of in the state. So of those 31 districts, we are the lowest. The average of 31 districts is 20,000 per pupil. And you can see that we are considerably lower than that. We're 27% lower than that. We're also the lowest spending district among the 50 districts in Monmouth County. Now that's interesting because the cost model, that's part of the funding formula, accounts for the difference in cost between a high school student, a middle school student, and an elementary school student. So as you would expect, a high school student is the most expensive. So with only high school students, you would anticipate that Freehold Regional would be the highest spending district in the county, but we're not. We are the lowest spending district among all school districts in Monmouth County. So I think what this says, and what I intended it to say to you is, there's not much room to move within our budget. And part of the decision that the board's considering here tonight takes that into account, just not only for the year that we're just beginning here, but for the years that follow. This decision will have an impact on that. So let's touch base on local fair share. Take a moment to look at that chart. So what you're seeing here is the red line, which represents what the funding formula says the community should be paying in property taxes, right? So right now it's at 205 million. Our levy at the 2% is 155 million. So it's $50 million lower than the state's measure of what the community can afford. Now we take issue with that. We have taken issue with that, as I mentioned earlier, that we're in a legal process to get to the bottom of how exactly are you calculating that 205 million? Because we want to understand it and potentially challenge it depending on what it is, but we have not yet been able to get to the bottom of that. Now, let's not, from the state's perspective, this is as much of an art as it is a science, right? Because those two wealth indicators could be true if you have 5 houses in a row all with the same value. The affordability of property taxes is going to vary from household to household. So there's an art to it, but yet there still should be a predictable and defendable process to determine what the community can afford in property taxes. So we'll continue to pursue to get to the bottom of that, because this funding formula, the SFRA, is continuing until further notice. There's no discussion of replacing it and developing a new one. There is some discussion of revisiting it, and tweaking it is the word that we've heard used, which is not the magnitude that we need it tweaked. We need it changed, I should say. We need it changed in a more significant way, because as noted on the last slide, as we fall further and further below adequacy, that is going to impact what this district is able to offer. And we've made this case to a number of legislators over these last 2 years that the benefits of Freehold Regional being a regional district has some significant benefits. First, there's the economy of scale, which is part of the reason that our cost per pupil spending was so low. Another part of that is that with 10,000 high school students, you have a critical mass of student interest to make a program viable, right? There's enough kids interested in order to make that something that we can offer. And our range of student opportunities with a dozen magnet programs, IB, full range of athletics at multiple levels, I would put this district up against any district in the state as far as measuring student opportunities. So we feel comfortable with that. But what's being considered tonight is, and what this legislation permits is, okay, districts, we acknowledge that the 2% cap on the levy has prevented you from accessing your local fair share as was the design intent. So in a limited way, a portion of that you can access property taxes that should have been levied in previous years. So here's an important point that I want you to understand, is that although the opportunity to go above the 2% is very limited to this 2-month window, the benefits of it are sustained beyond the year ahead of us. So let me explain what I mean by that. The increase in the levy becomes part of the tax levy base, right? So it's not a 1-year additional $10,175,000 in tax levy. That becomes part of the base, so that stays in play. So from a property tax perspective, I think it's important that you understand that. From an operational perspective, that's important because it's not a spike in revenue that then drops off the following year. So there is certainly benefit to what we're doing in the year in front of us here, but there's also a long-term benefit for the budget years that follow. So this being $50 million below what the state says our local fair share is, this moves us to being $40 million below what our local fair share is according to the state. So I thought that was important to discuss tonight. With this, accessing the legislation tonight with an additional tax levy of $10,175,000, that reduces our adequacy deficit by 53%, so effectively cuts it in half. You know, this is one area where we have control over our decisions for this organization and this school community, but there are areas that we do not have any control, and that's how does the funding formula change? What will be our state aid in the future? That has been incredibly unpredictable. We find out in March of each year and then adopt the budget by the end of April, beginning of May. But the legislation that was recently passed does permit us to take action within the area that we do have some control. And it's a strategic decision. This was a fully considered decision of different variations of how we might want to put this legislation in play. But we felt that this was the reasonable, appropriate place to land, but acknowledging that it's an increase in the tax levy, and that's certainly something that's going to be felt by our community members. We'll talk about tax rate impact in a moment. So for the year, the current year, the next logical question is, well, how do you plan to use it? And as Dr. Hazel mentioned earlier, there are a dozen teaching staff members that will be rehired for the upcoming year. We lost 39 positions in this budget as originally constructed under the 2% cap. So that's important. There's also instructional support both at the district level and at the building level, funding for student programs, and also curriculum development and teacher training at the district level. There's also the reinstatement of the RAISE program, which is our twilight education program, which to a segment of our student population is very important to them, because it's really their opportunity to get their high school education. So that was cut in the original budget that was proposed at the 2%, so we proposed reinstating that. There's also enhanced facility security measures. That's in terms of our emergency lockdown notification system, also in improvements to our vestibules, right? So building out the man traps, locks on second sets of doors, those practices where we have not been able to do that in recent years because of S2 cuts and limited funding. Also address targeted facility needs. Now these are things that are larger ticket things, HVAC repairs across the district. Also exterior door replacements as needed. There's sidewalks that need to be redone, steps, outdoor steps that need to be done. There's also some bleachers that are not operating as they should. There's a number of things, and the one larger one on there is our portion of state grants that we got to do HVAC work throughout the district. So there's 60% is the district share, 40% is on the state, so there's $700,000 in there in the facilities end for that. But all of these things are things that, if not for S2, would have already been done by now. All right, but when you're an educational institution and funding is cut, of course you're going to preserve the core purpose of the organization, which is the educational component. And some of these other things have been delayed and we can address some of the more urgent areas now. Also, to reinforce the structural integrity of the budget, there was various pieces of equipment, technology infrastructure, and some buildings and grounds equipment that we were going to 5-year lease purchase, right, which just breaks up the payment into 5 years. We're proposing to outright purchase that, which provides relief in the subsequent 4 years budget, because I don't have those lease payments in there. Reduce appropriation risk. As I mentioned along the way, the decisions that we've made under the S2 years, one of those decisions is to take on increased risk, increased budget risk. So our appropriations are getting tighter and tighter and tighter, and there are dynamic organization. Of course, there are going to be unforeseeable costs. So this is to bring back 50% of the additional risk that we assumed for the year under the original budget design. And also return surplus. So the budget under the 2% included $2 million of additional surplus, which is effectively borrowing from the future year to support the current year. So we're going to return half of that as well. So all of these are, this is the use of the $10,175,000, and this is the year ahead of us benefit, but as I mentioned earlier, there's benefit long-term, just structurally, our financial footing, as Dr. Hazel mentions, that's also a benefit of this, which is accessing property taxes that should have been levied according to the state over the past several years. So property tax rate impact. So the tax rate is only one component of the calculation of what it means to property owners and their actual property tax bills. There are other variables. What have the values of the communities, how has that changed over time? And you can see that it's 4 up and 4 down, field regional overlays, 8 municipalities. And the single tax levy of the district each year is allocated to the 8 municipalities, and it's the state-imposed formula of how that's done. So that's why it's not all the same, and tax rates, not every community is at the same percentage of assessed value. So there are other pieces to that. What I would suggest for you as an individual homeowner is to understand this tax rate and then look at your own tax bill and talk to your municipal assessor if you have questions about your assessment. But the regional component of your tax bill, here are the changes that you can expect for this revised budget. So, in summary, the benefits of this legislation is to preserve student opportunities long-term, right, by reinforcing our structural budget position. It also reduces our adequacy deficit by just over half, and it moves us from $50 million below our local fair share, right, the measure of what property taxes should be, state's measure, to $40 million below that number. So all of this, while we continuously advocate for changes in S2, and I think that for the 24-25 year is the 7th and final year of S2. So I think the state is looking to make some adjustments to that. We would like a seat at that table, and we're hoping that it's meaningful adjustments to really stabilize funding for districts like Freehold Regional.